Have you ever noticed that the more you try to explain yourself, the more you lose control of the situation? We've been trained to believe that arguments convince people, that logic wins debates, but the truth is different. The more you talk, the more power you give away. Carl Jung already knew, silence isn't the absence of action, it's a language of control. When you learn to stay quiet at the right moment, the other person starts to reveal themselves. In this video, you'll understand why the smartest people don't argue, they observe, wait, and when they speak, no one forgets. So, watch until the end to learn how to use this silent trick that gives you power. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel if you haven't already. Have you ever walked away from a conversation feeling like you lost, even after explaining everything? You spoke, justified yourself, tried to prove your point, but deep down you felt something slipped away. That happens because silence is often control. But the truth is, it's when you stay silent that people really start to listen. Trolls, the more they seem right, the more they seem in control. But the opposite is also true. The more someone feels the need to explain themselves, the more insecure they appear. And that's when silence shows its power, not as absence but as presence. Carl Jung said, everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. Silence holds up a mirror, while words often serve as a distraction. Those who talk are trying to control the narrative. Those who stay silent are holding their ground. But there's a kind of power that doesn't shout. It watches, waits, moves only when needed. It's the power of someone who no longer needs to prove anything because they've already made peace with their truth. And someone who truly knows themselves doesn't jump into every fight, not out of fear, but out of choice. In this context, silence is strategic intelligence. It's not empty, it's a filter. It separates what deserves a response from what just wants a reaction. It disarms because it offers no resistance. And at the same time, it exposes. Those who crave control feel threatened by someone who doesn't react. That reversal is what confuses the weak. They expect confrontation, they need the game, the back and forth, the wordplay. When they're met with silence, they don't know what to do. They become disoriented. They start justifying themselves. There's refined emotional intelligence in the act of not responding, a silent wisdom that says more than any argument ever could. The one who observes before speaking is actually listening more deeply, not just to what the other person says, but to what they're trying to hide. Silence slows down your internal clock. While the ego wants to win, silence wants to understand. While impulse seeks control, silence seeks clarity. Jung said, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. That quote hits hard because those who don't recognize their own triggers live at their mercy. And talking too much is one of those triggers, the immediate reaction, the urge to be right, the need to explain everything. It could all just be your panicked unconscious trying not to lose control. But when there's awareness, there's a pause. And that pause, even if brief, is a space of power. Because in that gap between what you feel and what you say, your true self steps in. Those who develop this ability begin to realize that many provocations don't need a response because they don't speak to the self, they speak to the ego. And when the ego is calm, it doesn't engage in those kinds of conversations. Emotional intelligence isn't about having all the right answers, it's about knowing when no answer is needed. It's about holding the discomfort of silence without rushing to fill it. It's realizing that those who shout have often already lost the ability to listen, and that those who listen, even in silence, are always one step ahead. Of course, this kind of silence takes practice. It requires unlearning the idea that staying quiet means losing. It demands that you endure the internal discomfort of not reacting. But over time, this silence becomes a safe place, an inner space where nothing needs to be defended, where energy is preserved for what truly matters. And then when it's time to speak, the words come from your center, direct, clean, without excess, because those who master silence don't speak to prove a point. When someone takes your silence as a mild accusation, they explode in anger, sarcasm, or retreat. Their tone shifts, their posture stiffens, arguments pile up. They're not just responding to the present moment, they're protecting an old pain that formed long ago. The complex has taken the wheel. Jung said, you don't get rid of a complex by fighting it, you get rid of it by making it conscious. And that awareness begins with silence. When instead of reacting instantly, you pause and ask yourself, who wants to speak right now? Is it my conscious self, or is it an old wound trying to defend itself? Silence here isn't just the absence of speech, it's internal listening. It's paying attention to the body, to the tension, to the urgency rising from within. When there's too much impulse, there's almost always pain surfacing. And if you respond without realizing that, the complex grows stronger. It feeds on unconscious reactivity. But when you choose silence, not the kind that suppresses, but the kind that observes, something shifts. You begin to separate what belongs to you from what belongs to the past, what truly needs to be said from what just wants to scream. The complex no longer runs the show, it becomes something to be understood. This is where emotional freedom begins, when you realize that not every reaction needs to become a word, that not every pain has to become a defense, and that silence in this case isn't weakness, it's clarity. Because only those who can hear the voice screaming inside can consciously choose what's actually worth saying. Much of what we say in public doesn't come from our true center. It comes from the image we've built to be accepted. Jung called this image the persona, the social mask we wear to function in the world. And it's useful, it protects us, smooths relationships, helps us play roles. But sometimes it talks too much. When someone speaks in a rush, with too much certainty, needing admiration or validation, it's often not the self speaking. It's the persona trying to hold itself together. The persona of the smart one, the fair one, the spiritual one, the always balanced one, it needs to maintain the image. And to do that, it talks, explains, defends, proves. But the shadow, everything we've repressed, denied, forgotten, doesn't speak, it stays silent. And that's why true silence is so unsettling. Because in silence, there's no character, no argument, no script, just what is raw and whole. And sometimes that's exactly why we avoid silence. It exposes what the persona wants to hide. Jung said that facing the shadow is inevitable for those seeking authenticity. And deep silence, the kind born from presence, is one of the most powerful spaces where this encounter happens. In silence, the persona shrinks and the shadow steps forward, sometimes as discomfort, sometimes as scattered thoughts, old fears, forgotten guilt. That's why many people prefer to fill the void with words, not out of arrogance, but out of fear. Because in silence, control slips away. And what surfaces isn't always pretty or organized, but it's real. When you learn to notice when you're speaking from a need for image instead of true presence, something begins to shift. You listen to yourself, and by listening, you start choosing what truly needs to be said. Silence at that point becomes a mirror, and it's a mirror that others can't always decipher. Because when you speak little but show up fully, your presence disrupts their masks. And that's power, not the power to manipulate, but the power to remain untouched by what isn't essential. There are people who walk into a room and without saying a word shift the energy, not because they try to impose anything, but because their presence alone is enough. They don't rush to explain who they are or prove what they know. They simply are, and that's all it takes. That kind of presence isn't built in the ego. It's born from the inner silence of someone who no longer needs to be seen to feel whole. This silent presence is the opposite of performative charisma. It doesn't seduce, compete for attention, or move to please. It simply exists. And for that very reason, it commands respect. It's the external reflection of a psyche that has found rest within itself, that no longer needs to rush outward because it's already rooted inward. Carl Jung said, "The unconscious doesn't respond to explanations, it responds to symbols." And silence is a powerful symbol. It communicates depth. It suggests that there's more than what meets the eye. It creates the space that makes others reposition themselves. In silence, someone who is truly present begins to guide the energy of the room, not through control, but through centeredness. That power doesn't come from what's said, it comes from what's sustained. And to sustain it, one must have done the inner work of recognizing their own worth without relying on external validation. Those who feel the need to constantly explain themselves still don't fully believe in who they are. Those who stay quiet with confidence have stopped negotiating with doubt. Silence in this context isn't just the absence of sound, it's the absence of need. It's the stillness of someone who has listened deeply enough to no longer depend on a reply. And that stillness isn't coldness, it's clean presence without excess, a restrained but perceptible energy, almost like creative tension. Others feel it, but they can't quite name it. That's the difference between presence and performance. Performance grabs attention, presence shifts the atmosphere. And that can't be taught through technique, it's cultivated through depth. When you can sit in silence without feeling the need to justify yourself, you're not just free, you become a reference. Not because you tried to be, but because your silence speaks louder than any attempt at persuasion. Not everything we communicate comes through words. In fact, most of our presence is conveyed by what the body reveals: posture, breath, rhythm, gaze. Before we even speak, we send signals that tell others who we are, how we feel, and how centered or off-center we are. And when the ego quiets down, the body begins to speak with more truth. The silent language of the body is subtle but powerful. A well-timed pause, a gaze that holds without challenging, a posture that fills space without arrogance, all of this creates impact. It's the kind of authority that doesn't shout but settles in. It doesn't demand respect, it simply receives it. Emotionally grounded people don't need to explain themselves in a rush. They have rhythm. They speak when they choose to, not when they're pulled. They wait, they listen. And even in silence, they say so much. I don't react, I choose. That kind of communication carries massive symbolic weight because it shows inner mastery. And those who master themselves are rarely mastered by others. Jung understood the depth of nonverbal gestures. For him, everything in the psyche has symbolic form, including how the body expresses itself. When the ego is agitated, the body gives it away: restless hands, a rushed voice, tense shoulders. But when the self is in charge, the body relaxes, and this calm is unconsciously read by others as confidence. So silence isn't just the absence of speech. It's alignment between internal presence and external expression. The body, when freed from the need to defend itself, begins to transmit real trust, and trust is felt before it's explained. Whoever masters their own body masters the atmosphere, not through manipulation but through guidance. It's the difference between someone who tries to convince with words and someone who convinces through their wholeness. The body tells the truth that speech sometimes tries to disguise. That's why it's not enough to go quiet on the outside, you have to quiet down on the inside. This kind of silent communication can't be faked. It's born from continuous inner listening, from the habit of not rushing, from breathing before acting, and above all, from the awareness that not every response needs to be verbalized. Because often what transforms a space is the posture of someone who, in silence, holds their presence, not because someone tries to convince someone else, but because they don't need to say anything to be enough. The book The 48 Laws of Power by Robert Greene made me completely rethink the way I view silence and speech, too. The first time I read it, I'll admit, it felt provocative, even uncomfortable at times. But over time, I realized it was simply exposing what's already happening all the time, just unconsciously. And one idea stuck with me: simple but powerful: say less than necessary. That phrase might sound like a communication tip, but it holds a deeper psychological insight. According to Greene, speaking too much is a way of betraying yourself. When you speak impulsively, you reveal insecurity. When you justify yourself excessively, you give away more than the other person needs to know. And when you're trying to convince someone with too many words, you're often just trying to convince yourself. Speaking less in this context isn't about hiding, it's about protecting. It's observing before acting. It's not handing over your intentions on a silver platter. Strategically silent people create tension. They leave space for the other person to reveal themselves, to fill the silence with projections, mistakes, or things they couldn't hide if someone were really listening. Greene shows how silence positions you. Yes, it can make others uncomfortable, but that's exactly why it works. Silence reveals the control in the one who holds it. And the strangest part, the more the other person talks, the more they unravel, especially if they're trying to manipulate, dominate, or win with words. This perspective on power isn't just social, it's deeply psychological. When you master silence, you master your ego. You don't need to respond to everything, prove anything, or explain everything. You choose when and how to speak, and that gives every word weight. Jung spoke of inner presence, Greene speaks of strategic presence. When those two meet, you get the kind of silence that commands without raising its voice. But it's not just Greene or Jung who support this idea. Ancient Taoist wisdom taught this more than 2,000 years ago. Laozi, an old Taoist master, said, "He who knows does not speak, he who speaks does not know." In Taoism, silence isn't an action, it's connection to essence. The wise don't need to prove their worth, they act with presence, and that's enough. Silence in this context is a gesture of harmony with the natural flow of life. Speaking too much means going against life's rhythm. Blaise Pascal, the 17th century French mathematician, philosopher, and theologian, wrote, "All of humanity's problems stem from man's inability to sit quietly in a room alone." For him, silence was a portal to self-knowledge. The inability to be still, inwardly or outwardly, reveals a restless mind disconnected from itself. According to Pascal, real balance begins when you can be alone with your own presence without needing noise to escape yourself. And I could name so many others: philosophers, spiritual teachers, neuroscientists, therapists, who in different ways arrived at the same conclusion. Silence, when it comes from awareness, is power, an invisible trick, a key to inner authority. And maybe that's the most unsettling secret. The more you quiet yourself internally, the more the world pays attention to what you represent externally. Silence has a disarming effect. It holds up a mirror to the other person. When you don't react, the one speaking starts to hear themselves. When you don't fill the space, the other reveals themselves. It's as if by stepping out of the game, you force the other to deal with their own noise. That's not passivity, it's deep psychological strategy. Many expect confrontation. They expect arguments, rebuttals, resistance. When they're met with silence, they lose their script. Some try to provoke even more, others get lost in their speech. Silence disarms because it breaks the expected pattern. It takes the opponent out of their role and forces them to improvise. And it's in that improvisation that masks slip. Well-placed silence isn't withdrawal, it's spatial command. You don't impose, but you occupy. You don't pressure, but you draw in. And that takes presence. Being silent with insecurity doesn't have the same impact as being silent with clarity. People feel the difference. Silence from a wounded ego is retreat. Silence from the self is centeredness. Jung spoke of the transcendent function as a process of integrating opposites. When there's an internal conflict between the urge to react and the need to stay whole, silence creates fertile ground for that tension to mature. Instead of picking a side, you hold the tension, and from that tension, something new can emerge. The same applies to relationships. When you don't rush to explain, to convince, or to attack, you create space for the other to reveal their own complexes. It's what happens in arguments where one person goes quiet and the other, uncomfortable with the silence, starts contradicting themselves, justifying the unjustifiable, exposing what they never meant to show. That's not manipulation, that's clarity. It's knowing the game doesn't always need to be played, that there's more power in sustaining silence than in winning a debate, that often the one who stays quiet with awareness holds the higher ground, not to dominate but to remain centered. The silence that disarms others is the same one that reveals you, because in it you discover how little you actually need to react, and that alone is freedom. Not all silence is a choice. For many people, silence hurts not because there are no words, but because the emptiness brings back something too old to remember clearly. In those cases, silence activates wounds that haven't healed yet: abandonment, rejection, exclusion. What should be a pause becomes a threat, and the urge to speak, to explain, to fill the space becomes survival. Some people panic in the face of silence because it exposes what they lived through without care. Children who were ignored, adults who were never heard, people who had to scream to feel seen. That scream doesn't fade with time, it just changes form. It becomes compulsive speech, relational anxiety, fear of being alone, fear of being misunderstood. Jung said, healing happens when we accept what is. And accepting silence is part of that healing, not silence as absence, but as fertile ground where listening can happen. For those who carry trauma, being quiet isn't simple, but it can be revolutionary. Because in silence begins the process of tolerating your own presence without needing to defend against it. The fear of silence often comes from the fear of hearing the body, the pain, the questions that don't have answers. But running from that only keeps the trauma alive. It's in silence, when the outside world quiets down, that the inner world begins to speak. And when that voice trembles, it needs to be heard. Self-mastery starts there, not in rigid control over what you feel, but in your ability to hold space for what comes up. Being silent in the face of provocation is hard. Being silent in the face of your own past is even harder. But if you can, even for a moment, avoid responding to trauma with more noise, you've already begun to break the cycle. In this context, silence is an act of courage. It's saying to yourself, I'm here, I can bear to listen. And when you do that, something starts to reorganize. The internal scream loses power, the fear becomes tolerable, and silence stops being a threat, it becomes a portal. Because when you stop running from yourself, your voice returns with a different quality, not from desperation, but from wholeness. And that changes everything. In the end, silence isn't just the absence of sound, it's the presence of self. It reveals what remains when you're not trying to convince, explain, please, or win, what remains when you simply are. And that, simple as it may sound, is the destination of a deep process of self-knowledge. Because only those who have truly listened to themselves can hold silence without fear. Many still associate silence with weakness, with a lack of arguments, with defeat. But true strength lies in the one who doesn't need the last word, because those who feel the need to speak constantly are often trying to protect themselves. Those who are silent with awareness aren't hiding, they're holding. Carl Jung said, don't hold on to anything that needs to be defended all the time. That applies to opinions, personas, and things we tell ourselves. If something needs constant reinforcement, it's still fragile. Silence, on the other hand, belongs to those who know what's whole, steady, integrated. True silence comes when the ego quiets down and you take over. You don't need to react to everything, to explain every move, to prove who you are. There's just presence and the conscious decision to let your energy communicate what needs to be said. That silence isn't retreat, it's choice. It's not escape, it's positioning. It rises from within and holds. Even when the world outside demands noise, it knows how to wait, how to watch, how to act at the right moment. And when it speaks, it wastes no words. Because every word that comes from that silence carries the precise weight of what's needed. To know how to be silent is to know who you are without needing anyone else to confirm it. It's not putting yourself in battle with every provocation. It's choosing where your attention goes and not handing your peace over to every external stimulus. And maybe that's the simplest and most powerful key. When you can hold silence in the face of provocation, of doubt, of neediness, that's when you realize how far you've come. So next time someone provokes you, tries to steal your peace, pushes for a reaction, just stay silent and ask yourself, who's speaking louder now, you or your ego? If this video spoke to something inside you, if the silence we explored here touched you in some way, subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications to keep learning about psychology, awareness, and the kind of intelligence that doesn't shout but transforms everything. And if you made it to the end, drop a comment below. Silence is intelligence too. That phrase tells me you didn't just watch it through, you're learning how to turn presence into power. And now we'll see you in the next video.